Ayuban, Wanakam, and Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much to Sri Lankans for Black Lives Matter LA for inviting me to speak to you all today. And just to tell you a little bit about me, I'm a professional actress currently based in London, UK. I'm originally from Kandy, which is a hill town in the central province of Sri Lanka. And before embarking on my acting career, I also worked for a time with the Asian Human Rights Commission in Hong Kong. And I worked on human rights cases in Sri Lanka and Indonesia. And this was during the last years of the war in Sri Lanka. So I would say race is my personal detonator. I became very aware of my brownness at a very early age because I was reminded of it every day in some way, shape, or form. And I've marched at Black Lives Matter protests over the years, and this year was no exception. And I march in solidarity with my Black brothers and sisters because it is the very least I can do. Now, I started reading about Malcolm X, Angela Davis, Rosa Parks, the Black Panthers, Stephen Biko, Martin Luther King, the civil disobedience movement in India, the civil rights movement in America. And they taught me how to wear my brownness with pride. And there is not a single minority group in this world who has not been served by the courage of Black people who have been at the front lines of this struggle for centuries, particularly African Americans. Now, this year has been seismic in many ways. And the conversation about race, racism, and its history is being had on a scale that is unprecedented. And I've no doubt that you all in America can testify to that. Now, I occupy an interesting position, and I'm sure many of you can say the same also. In the country I live in, I am a minority within a minority, and the same is true of my position in the industry I work in. But in the country I come from, I am part of the majority. And whether I like it or not, I'm the recipient of all the privilege that comes with not only being Sinhalese, but also middle class. And in Sri Lanka, I would probably be considered upper class. And it's a very uncomfortable contradiction. So when you see where we are as a world, to not acknowledge your own culpability is not only unacceptable, it's actually dangerous. And for me to stand on my soapbox and preach to white people about the unfairness of their inherited privilege, which I have done many times, without confronting the history of my own as a Sinhalese Sri Lankan is totally hypocritical, right? And I mean, we're frustrated, right, as brown and Black people, that these conversations are only really seriously being had now in 2020. But the conversation about racism in Sri Lanka hasn't even started. And that's even after a 30-year-long civil war. And it was very telling to see how strongly our Tamil brothers and sisters resonated with the grievances of the African American community. And online, I saw a lot of Sinhalese people being actively checked on their protests and protest slogans saying Sri Lankans for Black lives when we haven't been marching for Tamil or Muslim lives. So let's look at that. So I wanted to start with this quote by the brilliant James Baldwin. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Now, looking at us as a nation, as a people, at this point, post-war, what have we learned? How have we healed? And what is the cost of not learning or healing? And those are three questions I just want you to have a think about during the course of this presentation. The majority of that responsibility can only lie with the majority, because without them, healing, change, and reconciliation simply cannot happen. So it was in the spirit of stepping up to that responsibility that I decided to do these interviews. What is it like to be a minority in Sri Lanka? And there's only one way to find out, and that's pass the mic. So I started with the people that I know, family, friends, and friends. And as you can see on this slide here, so I carried out the interviews over the phone. And with their permission, recorded them. And the interview sample was a mix of Sri Lankans living in Sri Lanka and abroad. And in terms of the Sri Lankans living abroad, some of them were Sri Lankans who had recently made the move. And then you also had some Sri Lankans who had made the move during that period of conflict. So kind of we had 3 successive waves of riots. And so some of the interviews were with Sri Lankans who had moved during that time. And of course, the identities of the interviewees have been kept totally confidential, although some of them were actually happy for their names to be disclosed. I didn't want to put them in any position where they might be in any way at risk. So I then went through and listened to the interview several times and typed up verbatim sections of the interview, which were either their personal stories or points of view. Now I speak Sinhala and I'm learning Tamil, but just I didn't want to take any risk in terms of the accuracy of the translation. So I got the help of a Sinhala translator and a Tamil translator, both women, to help me with the Sinhala and the Tamil translations. I was felt very strongly about making this project trilingual. And then I started posting the interviews in parts on social media. So if you can see on the left is how I introduced the interviews. I didn't want to talk too much about my personal point of view. I just wanted to introduce the interviews and let them speak for themselves. And I used Canva, which, by the way, has been hella useful for a lot of other work as well. And as you can see, it's not particularly fancy. I just wanted it to be accessible, which is also why I decided to post it in parts. First on Instagram and then later on Twitter and Facebook, but Instagram was the main platform simply because of its reach and also the conversations that were happening already on Instagram around the time of Black Lives Matter. Another reason behind my doing these interviews is because of a screenplay that I have been very badly working on for the last couple of years. And seriously, if any of you are gifted screenwriters, please help. And it's set in the months leading up to Black July. And so I knew I needed to do my research to do justice to what happened. And one of the interviews I did was with a couple who are close friends of my tati, my dad. And they left Sri Lanka soon after the 1977 riots, in which they suffered serious trauma in their family. They now live in the UK. And I spoke to this auntie and uncle separately. And both conversations took place shortly before the anniversary of Black July, which just, it hit home even harder, just confronting these cycles of pain that are still ongoing. And I was silently crying through many of these interviews because the shame and sadness I felt was actually physically unbearable. And we've forgotten as Sinhalese people because we can, but they can't, and they never will. This is an example of the Sinhala and the Tamil translations. So I posted English first, then Sinhala, then Tamil. This is a word cloud of the 2 interviews I've posted so far, so I know it's not a full picture, but what's interesting is how significant this word is right here. Sinhalese. And that for both interviewees, who come from completely different backgrounds and have completely different lifestyles, the word Sinhalese is so present in their experience of being Tamil and Muslim. Their experience of being Sri Lankan is so strongly defined by the fact that they are not Sinhalese. And their identity as Sri Lankans is measured against the standard, which is Sinhalese. And I think a lot of us living in the diaspora can identify with that, right? Where we're not the rule, we're the exception. Now, this is a very basic timeline of events leading up to the 1983 riots, which is taken as the unofficial beginnings of our civil war. We achieved independence in 1948, almost as an afterthought, really, after Britain let go of India the year before. And what we see from then on is a series of actions taken by the government which create a pressure cooker kind of situation. And this is very common among countries that were once somebody's empire. The formerly disadvantaged majority seeks to level the playing field, and with that comes a particularly aggressive form of nationalism. And I just want to say again, there is a lot of history missing here, and just some key points I want to throw in here just to give you more information. We had the Citizenship Act of 1948, which disenfranchised Indian Tamil plantation workers. The assassination of SWRD Bandaranayake in 1959, which then led to his widow, Sirimavo, becoming the first female prime minister in the world. 1972, Ceylon officially became known as Sri Lanka, and Buddhism was given primary position as the national religion of the country. 1975, the assassination of Jaffna Mayor Alfred Duraiappa, who was fast on the rise by then. So you see, by the time we get to 1983, we are already at boiling point, and it sadly does not stop there. These are images of the waves of riots, and the pictures speak for themselves, really. You see the destruction, the mob mentality, the violence. The picture on the top right is a picture, it's an image of the Satyagraha protests, which were led by Tamil politicians over the passing of the Sinhala Only Act in 1956. And the image in the center, which is probably the most haunting that I have seen, is of a Tamil man who was stripped naked and beaten to death at a bus stand in Borelle. And in Jude Ratnam's film Demons in Paradise, they actually meet the photographer who took this picture, and he said that he knew there was nothing he could do in that moment to save the man's life, and all he could think to do was document it. So I just wanted to, at this point, play a clip from the film Demons in Paradise, where Jude's uncle returns to Sri Lanka with him to make this film. Now, his uncle joined the LTTE after seeing his mother literally lose her mind after the 1983 riots. And this clip that we're about to see is a phone call between his uncles and their relatives in Jaffna.
வந்து நீ இயக்கத்தில் சேர போகிறேன்னு சொல்லி வழிகிட்ட நாள் ஞாபகம் இருக்கா?
ஓ, நான் வந்து ஒரு 3 நாள் நின்று அவங்களோட ஞாபகம் இருக்குல்ல. இது 3 நாள் நின்றுட்டு நான் நின்று யோசிச்சேன். இப்போ நான் டிசைட் பண்ணிட்டு தான் வந்தேன் போகிறேன். அதான் கண்ணெல்லாம் கலங்கி இது கையில் பேப்பரை மடித்து தந்தார். 3 பக்கத்தில் ஒரு ஃபுல் ஸ்கேப் ஷீட் 3 ஷீட்டில் நீங்கள் எழுதிங்க, நடுவில் கையெழுத்து கருப்பு இங்கில் எழுதிங்க. எப்படி தலைப்பு போட்டிருந்தீங்க, நீ ஒரு கெரில்லாவானா? எப்படி
நீ ஒரு
நீ ஒரு கெரில்லாவானாய்.
கெரில்லாவானாய். எனக்கு என்ன எழுதுனே ஞாபகம் இல்லை.
அது அது கெரில்லாவானாய் என்ன அதில் கடைசி இது மட்டும் எனக்கு ஞாபகம் இருக்கு. நான் நான் சொன்னேன் இந்தியாவுக்கு போறேன்னு சொன்னேன். கண்ணீரை கடலாக்கி என் கண்ணீரை கடலாக்கி என் நெஞ்சங்களை படகாக்கி என் அன்பை துடுப்பாக்கி உன்னை அனுப்பி வைக்கிறோம் மகனே ஓய்வா.
So to this day, there is no meaningful acknowledgement of what happened. When the war ended in 2009, there was a golden opportunity to reconcile, which was not taken. So these wounds remain very much open. And now in Jaffna, you see these memorial statues honoring the army and tour buses arriving of mainly Sinhalese people. You contrast that with the thousands of people in Jaffna still protesting over the disappearances of their loved ones and simply asking, where are they? So who exactly are we remembering and what are we choosing to remember? Fast forwarding us now to post-war present-day Sri Lanka. This is a report by Roshini Vikramasinghe for Minority Rights Group International. About the increase in religious intolerance in Sri Lanka. And this is kind of a snapshot of her findings. Number one, she found an increase in violence, racist propaganda, and hate speech towards the Muslim community, often led by extremist Buddhist nationalist groups. And you see in the top right box, if you kind of scroll down to the kind of near the bottom of that paragraph, where she mentions this idea of Sinhalese, which is basically lion's blood. And I've seen this written on the back of three-wheelers in Sri Lanka, for example, and that sends a very clear message. Number two, there's also been an increase in targeted attacks, harassment, and intimidation of Christian clergy members and evangelical Christian groups. A lot of this is based on accusations of conversions to Christianity of mainly poorer Buddhist families, and they are actually trying to push an anti-conversion law through Parliament as we speak. Number three, despite the Sri Lankan constitution guaranteeing the right to equality, non-discrimination, and freedom of religious worship, there seems to be a real lack of action on the part of the Sri Lankan state to prosecute hardliners and protect minorities. And speaking of hardliners, here's one. The Bodu Balasena, or BBS, they are a breakaway faction of the right-wing JHU party, and they are ultra Sinhala-Buddhist nationalists. And their leader, Nyanasara Theru, who is in the top left picture, you can see him aggressively pointing at an imam. Yeah, that's the leader. Nyanasara Theru is on the national list for the new parliament under the Rajapakshas. Now, their manifesto of uplifting Buddhism, the Sangha, and education on the Dhamma is not wrong, but their way of going about it is, which is at the expense of everybody else. So they have campaigned for a nationwide ban on the wearing of burqas and abhayas. They've also been campaigning for completely eradicating the certification of halal meat in Sri Lanka. And they've made sweeping accusations at their rallies, including that the Muslim-owned fashion retail chains Fashion Bug and No Limit have been forcibly converting their Buddhist employees to Islam, which is total bullshit. In 2014, they led a march with a number of other nationalist groups such as Ravana Balakaya on the Assembly of God and Cavalry churches in Hikkadua, which is in the south. They caused an estimated 2 million rupees worth of damage to the church building, threatened to kill the pastor, and burned copies of the Bible. That same year, shortly after Ñanasara Thero delivered a speech pointing to Muslims as the biggest threat to the future of Buddhism in Sri Lanka, a mob marched into the majority Muslim towns of Alutkama, Darga Town, and Berwala and started attacking people and vandalizing their businesses. And up to 100 people were injured or killed. And again, there was a real lack of active action taken by the state each time. And I just wanted to play a clip. This is in the aftermath of the Alutkama attacks, and I just wanted to warn you that some of the imagery is very upsetting.
They still smoulder many hours after they were burnt. Homes from which Muslims fled in advance, knowing of the rampage to come. Hundreds of hardline Buddhists tore through the neighborhood, torching Muslim dwellings. Some Sinhalese houses were attacked by Muslim mobs, though fewer. This Sinhalese woman said all the attackers were outsiders. Muslims and Sinhalese get on well, she said, and many others say the same. But this is where 3 Muslims were shot dead by night, according to their neighbours and family. The police are now telling us that we must not pass behind this cordon that has been put up, dividing the mainly Muslim quarter from the ethnically mixed area where the worst of the clashes took place and where bullets such as this one were fired. At the local mosque, there's more blood where some injured people were sheltered, and a lot of security forces, and a visit by a Muslim cabinet minister in contrite mood.
I cannot simply exculpate myself from the guilt that I have failed my people at a time like this.
The minister also blamed his own government for letting the extremist group, the Buddhist Brigade, hold a rally filled with hate speech on Sunday in Alutkama. Here, its leader, a firebrand monk, threatened what he called the end of Muslims if they attacked monks or Sinhalese. And so right now, Muslims are living in fear.
If they come in thousands, we have no way. We have no way to answer. So only thing we have to die, that's all.
The president has said the guilty in these riots will be brought to account, but his critics accuse the strongly Buddhist government of tacitly backing the extremism. The violence certainly places a big question mark over the government's continuous assertions that it's working for reconciliation. Charles Haviland, BBC News, Alutkama.
So I've seen these clips before, and they don't. You never get quite used to seeing your country in that state. I also just wanted to point out this quote that is at the bottom of the top right picture. This country still has a Sinhala police and a Sinhala army. If a single Sinhalese is touched, that will be the end of all Muslims. That was said by Ñanasara Thero shortly after the attacks on Alutkama. That's a lot of. I know there's a lot of sadness and pain that I've tapped into, and I want to end this presentation on a hopeful, loving note. So I just wanted to point to something which I found to be a key thread that ran through all my interviews, and that was love. So if you see, again, these are direct quotes from the interviews, and I just wanted to point out here, I mean, we are Sri Lankans. As much as the Buddhists love this country, we love this country as well. We're born in Sri Lanka. There's no people like your people. It's an amazing country. I miss my country. I love that country. And they've been hurt by our country because they love it so much. And their outrage and their protest, which some Sinhalese see as hostile, just simply needs to be read with a different lens. And instead of the anger, look to the pain underneath. And if you don't know, ask them and listen to what they have to say. I mean, imagine the Sri Lanka that could have been without this war and the constant conflict between us. And honestly, when I think about it, it brings me to tears. And the survival of one group does not depend on the suppression of another. And Sri Lanka is what it is because of this beautiful fusion of our peoples and cultures and languages and religions. And there are Sinhalese people who are speaking up, so there is reason to be hopeful. And here are just a few examples. Starting with the artist, activist, he's also a lecturer and curator, Chandragupta Tenwara, who is, there are two examples of his art at the top. And he does yearly exhibitions in Colombo to commemorate Black July. Dayapala Thiranagama, who is an activist, he was imprisoned and tortured for his activism in his late teens. He then later married Rajini Rajasingam, who parted ways with the LTTE and became an activist in her own right before she was then killed by the LTTE in 1989 for actively and openly criticizing them. Kumari Jayawardena, who she's an author of Feminism in the Third World and the White Woman's Other Burden. She also founded the Social Scientists Association in the 70s, been very openly vocal on civil rights in Sri Lanka. Ruki Fernando is an advisor to Inform, an human rights documentation center in Colombo, and they focus a lot on abuses during the war. And like many activists in Sri Lanka, he has been arrested, intimidated, and exiled for periods at a time, but he is still going. They are all still going. Wisdom Wednesdays and #Generation, I definitely recommend getting involved. I have actually been, I've tuned into Wisdom Wednesdays from the beginning. They are an incredible panel of proudly multi-ethnic and multi-religious Sri Lankan women, and they are all leaders in their own right. They have, they're directors of their own organizations, empowering women. They are interfaith speakers, and the facilitators of reconciliation, and they run bi-weekly panel discussions on Zoom, so you can catch up on previous discussions on YouTube if you just if you type in Wisdom Wednesdays, and then if you sign up, you get a link ahead of their live Zoom discussions, so definitely check them out. #Generation are incredible as well. They are a multi-ethnic collective. They've done incredible social media campaigns, and they have a huge following, especially amongst the youth in Sri Lanka. So they've done a lot to champion diversity. They've done a lot in terms of correcting malicious misinformation that is particularly harmful towards minorities. They've done a lot of, and always trilingual. They did a lot of great information like PSAs during the elections and public health campaigns. They're also on Instagram, so check them out. And that brings me to my last slide. Now we are seeing the rise of the right around the world, from Trump's America to Brexit Britain to Modi's India, and Sri Lanka is dancing to the same tune. Divisiveness, aggressive nationalism, regressive policies, communal violence, mistrust, and paranoia is the name of the game. We have to remain vigilant, hopeful, because there is reason to be hopeful, but stay vigilant. So I just wanted to end with this quote by Desmond Tutu, which says, "Hope is being able to see that there is light despite all of the darkness." And if you want to connect or have any questions for me, feel free to follow me on Instagram or Twitter. But thank you so much for listening to my talk.